Imagine you are a pilot 30,000 feet in the air, fuel critically low, engine warning lights flickering across your cockpit, and the one aircraft in the entire sky designed to save your life, the one aircraft built specifically to refuel you, is circling nearby but cannot do its job. Not because of enemy fire, not because of a mechanical failure caused by battle damage, but because the aircraft itself, brand new, fresh off the assembly line, costing the American taxpayer nearly $230 million per unit, was fundamentally broken from the moment it was delivered. This is not a scene from a Tom Clancy novel. This is not a hypothetical training scenario dreamed up by military planners. This happened. This is real. And for over a decade, the United States Air Force has been fighting a battle not against foreign adversaries, but against one of the most troubled, most expensive, and most controversial military procurement disasters in modern American history. This is the story of the KC-46 Pegasus. To understand why the KC-46 failure is so devastating, you first need to understand what an aerial refueling tanker actually does and why it is arguably the single most important aircraft in any modern Air Force's inventory. With that, Boeing promised the Air Force a revolutionary tanker. They promised a modernized, efficient aircraft based on the proven Boeing 767 commercial airliner platform, packed with advanced avionics, equipped with a state-of-the-art remote vision system that would allow boom operators to guide the refueling boom using cameras and screens instead of lying prone in the rear of the aircraft as they had done for decades, and capable of refueling virtually every aircraft in the American military inventory. What Boeing delivered was something very different. The early production aircraft were plagued with problems so severe, so numerous, and so fundamental that the Air Force was forced to accept deliveries with over 100 unresolved deficiencies per aircraft. Read that number again. Over 100 deficiencies per aircraft. These were not cosmetic issues. These were not minor software glitches that could be patched with an overnight update. These were systemic, deep-rooted failures that called into question whether Boeing had the quality control systems necessary to build a military aircraft to the required specifications. The remote vision system became the program's most notorious failure. The concept was elegant in theory. Rather than having boom operators physically positioned in the tail of the aircraft, straining to visually guide a telescoping refueling boom into a receiver aircraft's fuel receptacle, while experiencing the full buffeting and vibration of high-altitude flight, the new system would use a network of cameras mounted around the aircraft's exterior to provide operators with a high-definition view of the refueling operation on screens inside the aircraft. It sounded modern. It sounded advanced. It sounded like exactly the kind of technological leap forward that a 21st century military aircraft should represent. In practice, it was a disaster. The cameras produced distorted images. The resolution was inadequate for operators to accurately judge distances and alignment during the critical moments of fuel transfer. Colors appeared wrong. Depth perception was severely compromised. Boom operators who had spent years perfecting their craft using direct visual observation suddenly found themselves trying to perform precise mechanical operations while staring at screens that gave them fundamentally misleading information about what was actually happening outside the aircraft. The system was not just inadequate, it was dangerous. An improperly connected refueling boom can cause catastrophic damage to the receiver aircraft. At high speed, at altitude, a boom strike to the wrong part of an aircraft can be fatal. And the system designed to prevent that outcome was making the situation worse, not better. But the remote vision system was not the only problem. Not by a long shot. The KC-46 also suffered from what became known as Category 1 deficiencies, the most serious classification in the military acquisition system, representing flaws that could compromise the safety of the aircraft or its crew. Among these was the issue of foreign object debris, or FOD in aviation parlance. FOD is the bane of aviation safety. Loose items inside an aircraft, tools left behind during maintenance, fasteners that have come loose, materials that have worked their way into spaces where they do not belong, can be ingested into engines, can jam control surfaces, can cause catastrophic failures in systems that have no tolerance for obstruction. On the KC-46, inspectors found foreign object debris inside aircraft that had just come off the production line. They found tools. They found rags. They found hardware. They found detritus that had been sealed inside the aircraft during assembly and was now sitting in places where it could cause disasters. This was not a one-time quality control lapse. This was a pattern, a systemic failure in Boeing's manufacturing processes that suggested something had gone deeply wrong in the culture of the factory floor. The wiring issues that plagued early production aircraft were equally alarming. Aviation is fundamentally dependent on reliable electrical systems. Every control surface, every navigation system, every communication system, every safety system in a modern aircraft is connected to a nervous system of wiring that must be installed with absolute precision. On the KC-46, investigators found wiring that had been incorrectly routed. They found wiring that had been improperly connected. They found instances where the wrong wires had been connected to the wrong terminals in ways that could have caused electrical fires, control failures, or other catastrophic outcomes. The sheer number and variety of problems emerging from the production line painted a picture of a program that had been rushed, that had been inadequately supervised, and that had been delivered to the customer in a state that no responsible manufacturer should have found acceptable. The Air Force's response to these revelations was a combination of public frustration and private fury. General Marion Miller, who served as head of Air Mobility Command, the organization responsible for the Air Force's tanker and transport fleet, was blunt in her public statements about the KC-46 failures. She spoke openly about the aircraft's limitations, about the restrictions placed on its operational use because of its deficiencies, about the gap between what Boeing had promised and what Boeing had delivered. In military circles, where diplomatic language is the norm and public criticism of contractor partners is carefully measured, her candor was remarkable. It reflected the depth of institutional frustration with a program that was supposed to solve a critical capability problem and had instead created new ones while the old ones remained unaddressed. The financial dimensions of the KC-46 disaster are staggering. The original contract with Boeing was what the Pentagon calls a fixed-price development contract, meaning Boeing agreed to develop and deliver the aircraft at a price that was set in advance, with Boeing absorbing the cost of any overruns above that fixed amount. In theory, this structure was designed to protect the taxpayer by incentivizing the contractor to manage costs efficiently. In practice, it meant that as problems multiplied and costs soared, Boeing was forced to absorb losses that eventually reached billions of dollars. By some estimates, Boeing lost more than $7 billion on the KC-46 program in its early years. These losses were staggering even for a company of Boeing's size, and they created a perverse pressure dynamic within the program. As Boeing bled money, the pressure to cut corners, to deliver aircraft quickly even when they were not ready, to push problems downstream rather than fixing them upstream, only intensified. The financial structure that was supposed to protect taxpayers arguably made the quality problems worse by creating incentives that worked against careful, thorough engineering and manufacturing. Meanwhile, the Air Force was forced to make extraordinarily difficult operational decisions. The KC-46 aircraft that had been delivered, despite their numerous deficiencies, could not simply sit in hangars waiting for repairs. The service needed tanker capacity. The KC-135 fleet was aging. Every month that passed was another month of additional wear on airframes that were already decades past their originally intended service life. So the Air Force made the decision to operate KC-46 aircraft in restricted roles, in missions where their deficiencies would have the least impact, while continuing to push Boeing to fix the problems. It was a painful compromise, an acknowledgement that the service was operating aircraft that were not fully capable, that were not fully safe, that were not what they had paid for, but that it had no choice but to use them anyway because the alternative was even worse. The restrictions on the KC-46 operations were extensive and humiliating. The aircraft was barred from refueling certain categories of receiver aircraft entirely because the remote vision system could not adequately support those refueling operations. It could not perform night refueling operations with the same confidence as the aircraft it was supposed to replace. It had limitations on the weather conditions in which it could safely conduct refueling operations. For an aircraft that was supposed to represent a generational upgrade in American tanker capability, these restrictions were devastating. A tanker that cannot refuel certain aircraft is not a tanker. A tanker that cannot operate safely at night is not a tanker that can support the full spectrum of military operations. A tanker with restrictions on when and how it can do its primary job is a tanker that represents a step backward from what it replaced, not a step forward. Congressional oversight of the KC-46 program intensified as the problems became impossible to hide. Hearings were held. Witnesses were called. Boeing executives sat before skeptical lawmakers and attempted to explain what had gone wrong and what their company was doing to fix it. The testimony was often painful to watch. Promises were made and then broken. Timelines were announced and then slipped. Fixes were implemented and then found to be inadequate. The relationship between Congress, the Air Force, and Boeing became increasingly adversarial as years passed without the fundamental problems being resolved. Oversight committees published scathing reports. Inspectors General conducted investigations. The Government Accountability Office issued assessment after assessment documenting the program's failures and the slow pace of remediation. The human dimension of the KC-46 story is often overlooked in discussions that focus on technical specifications and cost overruns. But behind every contract modification and every program review are real people whose professional lives were shaped by this program's failures. The boom operators who had to learn to work around the remote vision system's limitations, who had to develop informal workarounds and techniques to compensate for a technology that was supposed to make their jobs easier but instead made them harder. The maintainers who spent countless hours tracking down foreign object debris and wiring problems in aircraft that should have been delivered clean. The test pilots and engineers who documented problem after problem and sent report after report up the chain of command, watching as their findings were acknowledged but not always acted upon with the urgency the situation demanded. The Air Force program managers who found themselves in the impossible position of managing a program that was delivering fundamentally deficient aircraft while the service's operational needs demanded that those aircraft be put into service anyway. The Boeing corporate culture that allowed the KC-46 problems to develop and persist is a subject that deserves its own examination. The Boeing of the early 2000s was not the Boeing of the post-war era. The Boeing that had built its reputation on engineering excellence and an almost obsessive attention to quality. The Boeing that bid on and won the KC-46 contract was a company that had undergone a profound cultural transformation over the preceding 2 decades. The 1997 merger with McDonnell Douglas had fundamentally changed Boeing's corporate DNA. The engineering-first culture that had made Boeing great had been gradually supplanted by a finance-first culture in which quarterly earnings, stock buybacks, and cost reduction had become the dominant priorities. The engineers who had once been the undisputed kings of the company found themselves subordinate to financial executives whose primary concern was not whether the aircraft worked perfectly but whether it could be produced profitably. This cultural shift would eventually manifest in catastrophes far beyond the KC-46, most visibly in the tragic crashes of the 737 MAX that killed 346 people. But on the KC-46, the consequences of that cultural shift were evident in every foreign object found in a production aircraft, in every incorrectly routed wire, in every failed quality inspection that somehow passed anyway. The Air Force's own role in the KC-46 disaster is a subject that requires honest examination. The service was not merely a passive victim of Boeing's failures. The requirements process that produced the specifications for the KC-46 was itself deeply flawed. Military acquisition requirements are produced through a process that involves multiple stakeholders, each of whom has legitimate interests in the final product, and the result is often a wish list that is more aspirational than achievable within the budget and schedule constraints that the program must also satisfy. The KC-46 requirements included performance specifications that pushed the boundaries of what could be realistically achieved with the technology available at the time the contract was awarded. And the pressure to meet those requirements on a fixed-price contract created conditions in which shortcuts became attractive to a company already operating under severe financial pressure. The oversight mechanisms that should have caught the KC-46 problems earlier also failed. The Defense Contract Management Agency, the organization responsible for monitoring contractor performance and ensuring that the government is getting what it is paying for, was clearly not adequately resourced or empowered to identify and address the KC-46 quality problems before they became embedded in production aircraft. The inspectors and auditors who should have been the first line of defense against the foreign object debris issues, the wiring problems, and the remote vision system failures either did not see the problems coming or did not have the authority to stop production when they did see them. The result was that dozens of aircraft were delivered in unacceptable condition before the full scope of the problem was officially acknowledged. The international dimensions of the KC-46 story add another layer of complexity. Japan became the first export customer for the KC-46, ordering the aircraft for its air self-defense force. When Japan's aircraft began experiencing the same problems as the American versions, the diplomatic and strategic implications were significant. Japan is one of America's most important Pacific allies, a cornerstone of the American security architecture in a region where tensions with China and North Korea make credible air power projection more important than ever. Delivering a defective tanker to Japan was not merely a commercial embarrassment. It was a strategic setback that had implications for alliance credibility and regional security. The Japanese experience with KC-46 deficiencies added international pressure on Boeing and the American government to address the program's problems with greater urgency. The remediation process for the KC-46's most serious problems has been long, expensive, and frustrating for all parties involved. The remote vision system problem, which was identified as a Category 1 deficiency almost immediately after the first aircraft were delivered, took years to fix. Boeing developed what it called the Remote Vision System 2, a completely redesigned camera and display architecture intended to address the fundamental problems with the original system. The development and certification of this new system took far longer than anyone publicly predicted. Testing revealed new problems. Software updates were needed. Hardware modifications were required. The timeline slipped year after year, and each time the Air Force and Boeing announced a new schedule for the fix, they had to come back later and explain why that schedule had slipped again. The persistence of foreign object debris issues throughout the production process was particularly troubling because it suggested that the root causes of the problem, the underlying quality control failures that allowed tools and materials to be sealed inside aircraft during assembly, had not been effectively addressed even after the problem had been publicly acknowledged. Solving a foreign object debris problem is not technologically complex. It does not require advanced engineering. It requires rigorous process discipline, accountability, and a culture that treats quality as non-negotiable. The fact that FOD continued to be found in KC-46 aircraft years after the problem was first identified suggested that the cultural and process changes required to solve it had not taken hold in Boeing's manufacturing operation. The broader context of Boeing's corporate crisis during this period is essential to understanding why the KC-46 problems proved so persistent. The 737 MAX crashes in 2018 and 2019 exposed the full extent of Boeing's quality and safety culture failures to the world. The scrutiny that followed those crashes led to congressional investigations, FAA oversight changes, criminal prosecutions, and an existential crisis for the company's reputation. In this environment, the KC-46 problems were no longer merely a military procurement story. They were part of a larger narrative about a once great American manufacturing company that had lost its way, that had allowed financial engineering to crowd out aeronautical engineering, that had prioritized short-term profits over long-term quality and safety. The converging crises forced Boeing to confront its cultural failures in ways that the KC-46 program alone might never have compelled. The financial reckoning continued to mount. Boeing's losses on the KC-46 program reached $7 billion and continued climbing. The company attempted to restructure its defense division, to bring in new leadership, to implement new quality management systems. But the scale of the accumulated problems was so large that progress was painfully slow. New KC-46 aircraft continued to be delivered with deficiencies, though the Air Force and Boeing both argued that the deficiencies being found in later production aircraft were less severe than those found in early aircraft. Critics argued that lower deficiency counts reflected lower standards for what counted as acceptable, not genuine improvement in manufacturing quality. The operational impact of the KC-46's limitations became most acute during military exercises and real-world contingency operations. Every time American military forces needed to project air power rapidly into a contested or remote region, the question of tanker availability and capability became critical. The restrictions on the KC-46 meant that planners had to carefully consider which missions could be supported by the new aircraft and which still required the aging KC-135 fleet. In a world of growing strategic competition, where the speed and flexibility of American air power projection are increasingly important deterrents, these operational limitations had strategic consequences that went far beyond the boundaries of any individual exercise or operation. The Air Force's long-term tanker recapitalization plan was seriously disrupted by the KC-46 problems. The original plan had envisioned a relatively smooth transition from the KC-135 to the KC-46, with sufficient deliveries of fully capable new aircraft to allow the gradual retirement of the oldest KC-135s. Instead, the service found itself in the position of needing to invest in additional KC-135 maintenance and sustainment to keep those aircraft flying past their intended retirement dates because the KC-46 aircraft being delivered could not fully substitute for them. The additional cost of extending KC-135 service life, money that would not have been needed if the KC-46 had been delivered as specified, represents another dimension of the program's financial impact that does not always appear in official KC-46 cost figures. The question of accountability has haunted the KC-46 program throughout its troubled history. Who is responsible for the failures of a program this large and this complex? The answer, uncomfortable as it is that responsibility is widely distributed. Boeing bears primary responsibility for delivering aircraft with so many serious deficiencies, for the quality control failures that allowed foreign object debris and wiring problems to persist, and for the inadequate remote vision system that was so far below the specified performance that it required a complete redesign. But the Air Force bears responsibility for a requirements process that may have set unrealistic expectations, for oversight mechanisms that failed to catch problems before they became embedded in production, and for decisions to accept delivery of deficient aircraft rather than refusing them and demanding compliance with the contract. Congress bears some responsibility for the funding and oversight structures that shaped the program. The defense acquisition system itself bears responsibility for structural incentives that can work against quality and in favor of schedule and cost performance in ways that ultimately prove more expensive for everyone. The lessons of the KC-46 program have been the subject of numerous studies, reports, and recommendations. Defense acquisition experts have pointed to the KC-46 as a case study in the dangers of fixed-price development contracts for complex military systems, arguing that the financial pressure these structures create can incentivize precisely the kind of quality compromises that plagued the KC-46. Others have focused on the need for stronger government oversight authority, arguing that program offices need more technical expertise and more authority to stop production when quality standards are not being met. Still others have focused on the cultural dimensions of the problem, arguing that no contract structure or oversight mechanism can substitute for a contractor who genuinely values quality and builds it into every stage of the manufacturing process. The technical challenges of the remote vision system deserve deeper examination because they illuminate a broader truth about the risks of betting on unproven technology in critical military systems. The fundamental problem with the original remote vision system was not that the concept was wrong, but that the technology required to execute it reliably had not been sufficiently developed and validated before it was incorporated into a production aircraft program. Cameras that can provide accurate, low-latency, high-resolution imagery in the challenging lighting conditions encountered during aerial refueling, including bright sunlight, night operations, and various weather conditions, are harder to build than they might appear. Software that can process that imagery and present it to operators in a way that gives them accurate depth perception and spatial awareness is genuinely difficult to write. Display systems that can render that information clearly enough to support precise mechanical operations are not trivial engineering problems. Boeing and the Air Force both underestimated these challenges, and the result was that a technology that had not been proven was incorporated into a program where it was not just one feature among many but the primary means by which the aircraft would perform its most important function. The contrast between the KC-46 program and historical military aircraft programs that succeeded despite enormous technical challenges is instructive. The development of the F-117 stealth fighter, for example, involved technologies that were genuinely revolutionary and had never been demonstrated in an operational aircraft. But that program succeeded in large part because the people running it were given the time and resources to get the technology right before they were forced to commit to production quantities. The KC-46 program, by contrast, was driven by schedule pressure and cost pressure that left insufficient time and resources to prove out the remote vision system technology before it had to work on operational aircraft. The lesson is not that ambitious technology should never be pursued in military programs, but that the timeline for delivering operational capability must be matched to the realistic pace of technology development, not to financial or political pressures that bear no relationship to engineering reality. The procurement reform implications of the KC-46 story extend well beyond the tanker program itself. The American defense acquisition system has been the subject of reform efforts for decades, and the KC-46 represents another data point in a long history of programs that have failed to deliver promised capabilities on time and on budget. What makes the KC-46 particularly instructive is the clarity with which it illustrates the failure modes of the current system. The corruption that infected the original competition shows the danger of allowing conflicts of interest to distort the source selection process. The problems with the fixed-price contract show the danger of using financial contract structures that are not appropriately matched to the technical risk of the development program. The quality control failures show the danger of relying too heavily on contractor self-certification and too little on independent government verification. The remote vision system problems show the danger of allowing schedule and cost pressure to drive technology development timelines rather than the reverse. As the KC-46 program has gradually moved toward resolution, with Boeing delivering updated aircraft featuring the remote vision system too and working to clear its backlog of deficiencies, the Air Force has begun planning for the next generation of tanker capability. The next generation air refueling system, which the Air Force has been studying for years, represents an opportunity to apply the lessons of the KC-46 disaster to a new program. Early signs suggest that the service and potential contractors are approaching the program with greater caution than the one that produced the KC-46, with more realistic technology development timelines and a more sober assessment of what can be achieved within budget and schedule constraints. Whether those lessons will actually be applied with sufficient discipline to prevent the next KC-46 remains to be seen. The story of the KC-46 Pegasus is ultimately a story about the gap between aspiration and execution, about the distance between what a complex organization promises and what it delivers, about the consequences of allowing financial, political, and schedule pressures to override the engineering discipline and quality culture that make great aircraft possible. It is a story about a defense acquisition system that has structural problems that have resisted decades of reform efforts. It is a story about a great American company that lost its way and is still struggling to find it again. And it is a story about the men and women of the United States Air Force who were handed a broken tool and were told to make it work, who did the best they could with what they had, who found workarounds and developed compensating techniques and maintained their professionalism even as they dealt with equipment that was not what they had been promised. The KC-46 has not been a complete failure. Aircraft have been delivered. Missions have been supported. The remote vision system has been redesigned and its successor is substantially better than the original. The foreign object debris problems, while they persisted far longer than they should have been addressed through process improvements in Boeing's manufacturing facilities. The aircraft's performance in missions that it can execute without restriction has generally been satisfactory. The path from broken promise to functional aircraft has been long and expensive and frustrating, but it has not been impossible, and the KC-46 fleet today represents a meaningful, if imperfect, addition to American air power capability. But the cost of getting to this point has been staggering. Billions of dollars in losses absorbed by Boeing. Billions more in additional KC-135 sustainment costs borne by the Air Force. Years of reduced tanker capability during a period when the strategic competition with China and Russia was intensifying. Damage to alliance relationships when foreign customers received the same deficient aircraft that American taxpayers had been given. Lost trust between the Air Force and one of its most important contractor partners. And perhaps most importantly, the human cost measured in the professional frustration and in some cases the career damage suffered by the people inside both Boeing and the Air Force who saw the problems clearly, raised their voices, and were not heard quickly enough or loudly enough to prevent the disaster from unfolding. The KC-46 Pegasus story is not over. The aircraft will be flying for decades to come. The complete resolution of its remaining deficiencies, the full integration of remote vision system 2 across the fleet, the achievement of the operational capabilities that were promised when the contract was signed. These are milestones that still lie ahead. Whether the KC-46 ultimately becomes the aircraft it was meant to be, a genuine replacement for the KC-135 that provides the Air Force with modern, capable, reliable aerial refueling capability for the 21st century, depends on the continued commitment of Boeing, the Air Force, and Congress to see the program through to its intended end state. The temptation to declare victory prematurely, to accept a good enough outcome rather than the excellent outcome that was promised and paid for, must be resisted. The American public deserves to understand this story. They funded it. They paid for every foreign object found in a production aircraft. They paid for every inch of incorrectly routed wiring. They paid for the redesign of the remote vision system. They paid for the additional years of KC-135 maintenance that were necessitated by the KC-46 failures. They paid for the congressional hearings, the Government Accountability Office investigations, and the Inspector General reports. They are still paying. The KC-46 disaster is not ancient history. It is an ongoing story whose final chapter has not yet been written. And the lessons it contains about accountability, about quality, about the dangers of letting financial pressure override engineering judgment, about the importance of honest communication between contractors and their government customers, are lessons that the entire defense acquisition community needs to internalize deeply and permanently if the next generation of military aircraft programs is to avoid repeating the same costly and dangerous mistakes. This is why the story of the KC-46 Pegasus matters. Not just as a tale of corporate and government failure, not just as a case study in procurement dysfunction, but as a mirror in which American defense institutions can see themselves clearly, can reckon honestly with what they got wrong, and can find the will to do better. Because in a world of growing strategic competition, in a world where China is building military capabilities at a pace that demands serious American attention, in a world where the credibility of American air power as a deterrent depends on that air power actually working when it is needed, getting the tanker right is not an academic exercise. It is a matter of national security. And the KC-46 disaster, for all its costs and all its frustrations, has at least given the American defense community the opportunity to learn, to reform, and to do better. The question is whether they will take it. So now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously. After everything you have just heard, after the billions of dollars wasted, after the years of reduced capability, after the foreign object debris and the broken cameras and the wiring problems and the congressional hearings and the Japanese alliance embarrassment, do you think the United States military procurement system is capable of genuinely reforming itself? Do you believe that the lessons of the KC-46 will actually be applied to the next generation of military aircraft? Or do you think that in 20 years, we will be sitting here watching a documentary about the next generation air refueling system disaster, wondering how we managed to make exactly the same mistakes all over again? Leave your answer in the comments below. Your voice matters in this conversation. And if this story opened your eyes to something you did not know before, share this video with someone who needs to see it, because an informed public is the best check on the systems that spend their money and defend their country.